Hi, my name's Catherine from Crime Psych, and in this series of videos I'm going to be taking a look at some serial offenders and psychologically analysing their behaviour. And as a criminal psychologist, I know that serial crimes such as these are thankfully very rare, but there is still quite a lot of interest in these crimes, and there is some value to examining the offences to see what we can learn from the offender's behaviour. And today we'll be looking at John Duffy and David Mulcahy, who were termed the Railway Rapists by the press at the time. They carried out a number of rapes and sexual assaults around London in the early 1980s and went on to commit 3 murders. This is a significant offence or series of offences to take a look at, because it's the first time that a psychologist had ever been brought in to help the police with their inquiries and to help to catch the perpetrator of the crime. In order to have an understanding of the psychology behind these attacks, it's sometimes necessary to look back through an offender's life, take a look at their early life, and see if there are any factors which may have given any clues that they may go on to offend in such violent ways. However, when we look at John Duffy's early life, there was nothing remarkable about his life. He was brought up by a loving mother and father. He didn't get into trouble at school. There was no domestic abuse as far as we know. It was just a normal family life. However, once Duffy reached high school, he was described as being quite quiet, a loner, and he stood out a bit because he didn't mix well with others. One pupil describes him as standing on the playground in his big parka jacket, not talking or not playing with anybody. And that's the first indicator that John Duffy didn't mix well with other people. He preferred to become isolated. He even tried to do that physically with that big parka jacket. He didn't want to engage with people. He found social interactions difficult and awkward. And so by wearing a big parka jacket, possibly with the hood up sometimes, he's physically closing himself off to the other pupils. And that did result in him being picked on by some of the other pupils until he became friends with a much bigger child, David Mulcahy, who became somewhat of a protector for John Duffy. And so the pair became firm friends throughout their school life. And between the ages for any child between the ages of 11 to 18 years old, it's quite a rapid period of development. We start to form our opinions, we start to test the boundaries within relationships, we start to push to find out what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. We start to explore our world, develop our attitudes, and personalities all begin to grow. And Mulcahy and Duffy found comfort and friendship within each other, and this led to them coming up with a game within the playground where they would chase some of the girls and catch them and touch them or tag them in some way, almost like a game of catch, kiss, or tick, or tag, or that sort of game. And the pair did go on at the age of 13 to torture animals, and they killed a hedgehog at the age of 13. And that's quite typical of some of the more sadistic killers that we've seen throughout history, and some psychopaths that we've seen. They normally start out harming animals from a young age. But if we go back to this game of chase and we begin to imagine how that must have played out for the pair. So they would have had a conversation at some point about what they were going to do that particular day outside, and between them they came up with this game where they were going to chase the girls and tag them or touch them in some way, not necessarily in any kind of an ominous way, but these girls would have been running around possibly screaming, and Mulcahy and Duffy found the thrill of the chase. They enjoyed that adrenaline rush, they enjoyed scaring the girls, they enjoyed making them scream. They discovered that they both took some pleasure from that, as well as taking pleasure from torturing animals and hurting and killing them together. And the pair did go on in adult life to commit a series of rapes around London, and over a period of 3 years 18 women were raped, and all of them gave similar descriptions of their attackers. Some of the women said that just one person had attacked them, and other women had said that 2 people had attacked them, and they'd all been attacked near to train stations or near alongside a train line. And so the police set up a major investigation in an attempt to catch the perpetrator of these crimes. And that's when they brought in David Canter to help them to find the perpetrator of these crimes before he'd managed to rape and kill again. In 1985, Alison was the first victim to be murdered. She'd got off a train at Hackney Wick Station and was walking to meet her boyfriend. But she'd been attacked, brutally attacked and raped by Mulcahy and Duffy. They had torn some of her clothing and used some of her clothing to strangle her using a unique tourniquet type device that they wrapped around the victim's neck. And after they tortured her and raped her, they disposed of her body in a nearby river. A year later, there were a further 2 murders. And those 2 murders were carried out in a similar way. They'd used the victim's own clothing to gag them or to strangle them in some way. And they'd used strangulation using this unique tourniquet method. So the police knew that all 3 murders were linked and carried out by the same offender. And so these crimes show an evolution over time. It started out with the thrill of the chase on the playground. They got a thrill from scaring these girls. Ultimately, that wasn't enough, so they went on to rape these women, and they went on to torture the women, and ultimately went on to murder these women. Now, if we take a look at a much lighter example of a progression of behaviour, I'll tell you about my sister. When we were young, she was 8 years old, I was 6.5, we went on a holiday to Butlins. And there was a donkey derby race being done at the time where the children would sit on donkeys and race round a track. And so my sister was entered into this donkey derby, sat on the donkey, and it ran really fast around this track. And she screamed her little head off all the way around. And my parents were obviously quite worried at that point that, you know, she was so scared and screaming on this donkey. But when they'd rushed to her afterwards, they'd found that she was laughing and still screaming, and she'd wanted to go around the track again because she'd had an adrenaline rush from that experience. She'd found it thrilling and exciting, and she wanted to do it again. She wanted to experience that thrill of the adrenaline rush again. And so as a result of that, she encouraged me to become more adventurous with my behaviour, and she would encourage me to swing really high in the pirate boat swings which they had at Butlins. And we'd swing higher than all the other children. And in adolescence and in young adult life, we moved on to roller coasters for that thrill, always seeking that adrenaline rush. You know, we started out with fairly slow, fairly mundane roller coasters, which when we look back now, we think, well, they were kind of boring. But the point is that there was a progression. You know, after we've been on all of these roller coaster rides, there was no way a donkey ride was ever going to be as thrilling as it was when she did it for that first few times when she was 8 years old. And that ultimately led to my sister doing a control free fall jump off the stratosphere in Las Vegas. Can you imagine ever finding a donkey ride thrilling after jumping off an 850-foot building? It was never going to be the same again. It's never going to be as exciting as it was in those early years. And so that type of progression, looking for more excitement, pushing the boundaries, having that affirmation, doing it with a partner, encouraging it, shows the type of progression that the pair went throughout their offences. And they discovered that rape was something that both excited them and that they both wanted to do. They'd found the thrill of the chase in the playground, went on to the rapes, and ultimately went on to carry out the murders. Duffy was arrested and convicted of 18 murders and of 18 rapes and of 2 murders, and he never implicated Mulcahy within those offences until some years later, while he was having sessions with a forensic psychologist, and he disclosed that he had an accomplice for the crimes. And he went on to describe to her that Mulcahy would instigate and take the lead in many of the behaviours, and that explanation would fit within their personality as they grew up. Mulcahy was always the bigger child of the two. He was a protector, he led John Duffy. This in no way detracts from John Duffy's culpability within it, but David Mulcahy has never admitted to any of the offences, although he has been convicted of the murder and of the rapes as well. And throughout the trials, it became evident that Duffy had worked on the railway lines at an earlier age, and so he had a good understanding of the rail network. He talked about Mulcahy and himself going out looking for victims, and they would drive around to these train stations where they knew women would be getting off, where they knew that they would be vulnerable and have to walk down dark pathways. And the pair would call it going out hunting, and they would even play Michael Jackson's Thriller while they were going out looking for victims. So this was a game to them. This was something that excited and interested them, and they were doing for their enjoyment and their excitement. And so, of course, this highlights that the victims were of no real significance to the pair. Unfortunately, these women happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is very rare to have a murder where the victim and the offender don't know each other. However, in this case, as it transpires, it's the offender and the place which have the common bond because he knew them from travelling around so much while he worked on the railway. And it shows that as the series of rapes and murders went on, they wanted to push the boundaries, to push each other as far as they would go. They did both get married. John Duffy's marriage did eventually break down, and his wife accused him of raping her and domestic abuse, and the pair subsequently split up before Duffy was arrested. And that just shows the level of disregard and disrespect which John Duffy had developed towards women by raping and by attacking and beating his own wife, whereas David Mulcahy remained happily married, and he had the front of a happily married man. And in the years that Duffy was initially in prison alone and Mulcahy was out, Mulcahy lived a very idyllic family life. He would help his neighbours in with the shopping, he'd be friendly, he would do anything for anybody, as his neighbours would describe him. People who knew him were quite shocked to learn of his dark behaviours and of these murders, because they never imagined that he would be capable of doing such a thing. And when you think about it, we are different people in front of different audiences. So again, going back to a lighter example, going back to me, when I attend conferences or do lectures or speak in schools, I'm quite professional. I speak quite slowly, fairly clearly, whereas when I'm out with my family, I might shout, I might scream, I might laugh, I might be a bit silly. Or when I'm with my children, I might be very organised, I might be quite demanding of some of the tasks or jobs that they need to do around the house. So for different audiences, I put on a different hat. And so that's exactly what David Mulcahy managed to do, is to put on this family man, happily married front to all of those who knew him. And it did come as a shock later when he was convicted of those murders. And this series of crimes is significant because, as I'd already mentioned, this was the first time a psychologist had been brought in to help the police with their inquiries and to help to catch the perpetrator of the crime. Professor David Canter had worked with Detective Constable Rupert Heritage and sifted through all of the masses of information which they'd got, and they travelled to the various locations. And David Canter pointed out the series of places which these offences had been committed at, and he started to map these out. He marked them on a map from the first offence through to the last rape, up to the two murders. And what he found was that there was a starting point for these offences, and the rapes stretched out along the railway line, and at the furthest point were the three murders. And so it showed a logical progression on a map of how the offences began to evolve. So not only did they evolve behaviourally, they evolved spatially as well. And so then that gave rise to Professor David Canter developing geographical profiling after this case was finished. He worked with computer programmers to come up with a program called Dragnet, whereby a series of offences could be put into this computer system, and it would work out using various algorithms the likely home base or starting point for an offender. And so that's been used worldwide now, and is a very common, reliable tool to establish a home base of an offender. And the second major thing to come out of this inquiry was the fact that a psychologist could develop a profile and could suggest characteristics of the offender based on the evidence and information which the police already had. David Canter simply helped them to organise it in a way that these salient aspects, these obvious aspects of the offender could be drawn out from that information. Okay, that's it for today then. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and found it interesting. You can hit like, you can subscribe to this channel, you can comment and leave me a question if you want to. You could even go over to the website and sign up to the newsletter to be notified of any blogs or vlogs or newsletters which are coming out. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.